Formula 1 teams have offered their broad support for the introduction of a sprint race experiment this year, which could be rolled out at 3 Grand Prix during the 2021 season. After running effectively the same weekend format since knockout qualifying was introduced in 2006, with the exception of elimination qualifying's 2-race stint in 2016 and the 2-day weekend at Imola last year, F1 is finally on the cusp of a major change in approach. The idea is to overhaul the traditional weekend format, practice on Friday, qualifying on Saturday, and the race on Sunday. It's been that way for years. Under this plan, qualifying will be shifted to Friday. That will then decide the grid for a sprint race on Saturday. This sprint race will then decide the starting order for the main Grand Prix on Sunday. For those who don't know, a sprint race is basically the same as a normal F1 race, but condensed, with a shorter distance of 100 kilometers and will take a maximum of 1 hour to complete. F1's planned trial of sprint races is likely to be at the Canadian, Italian and Brazilian Grand Prix this year, but locations are still to be finalised. Formula 1 has never officially run a sprint race before, but there has been talk of changing the format for a long time. Teams have held back the introduction of other concepts, such as a reverse grid, where the fastest drivers from qualifying would start at the back of the field. However, in Formula 2, the sprint race has long been held on Sunday mornings, and at 120 km long is 50 km shorter than the main event feature race on Saturdays. From 2021, there will be 2 sprint races per weekend in Formula 2 and Formula 3, taking place on Saturdays. The tightrope between entertainment and gimmicks was one F1 always has to tread carefully, but new CEO Stefano Domenicali quickly made his feelings clear, saying earlier this month that any plans for a reverse grid were over, but the sprint races were on the table for 2021. A recent F1 Commission meeting saw teams discuss the plans, and unlike the reverse grid proposal, everybody was on board. A new working group is being formed as we speak, and will aim to get a full plan in place soon so the final decision can be made before the new season begins. Whilst initial approval from all of the teams is a massive step forward for F1, there are some big questions that still need to be answered. One of those is what status the sprint race winner would hold in the record books. Would they have the official pole position for the Grand Prix, or would that still be reserved for the fastest driver in qualifying? And could we call the sprint race victor an official race winner? It's a technicality that F1 will need to clarify, and not just for the sake of the record books. Driver contracts often centre around the number of races completed, as well as dealing in official results and wins. So there must be a clear definition from a legal standpoint what constitutes a race. There will also need to be clarity on how the addition of sprint races impacts aspects such as tyre usage and part life. A tyre solution appears simple, given the teams will save sets with just 1 practice session instead of 3. On the parts front, teams have strict limits on how many power unit components they can use each season. But sprint races would undoubtedly add to the stresses placed on these parts, and of course, any spares from extra damage that might come from more wheel-to-wheel action. There will also be questions over matters such as grid penalties, and whether or not they could be served in a sprint race instead of a Grand Prix. The points and prize money system also needs to be clarified. The awarding of points would add some extra spice to the sprint races, and leave drivers really weighing up the risk and reward of trying to spice up the order. Given the distance is set to be 1/3 of a regular Grand Prix, awarding points at a similar weighting would seem logical, but this still needs to be determined, and may be controversial to some fans. Another big question surrounds race selection. Monza was an obvious pick, given its high-speed nature and chances to overtake, with last year's incredible race won by Pierre Gasly being the trigger for fresh talks over new format changes. Interlagos and Montreal are both logical picks. Again, their layouts encourage overtaking, but there will inevitably be questions over their viability this year, given that neither race happened in 2020. It does show the confidence that F1 has in this year's current schedule, but should any of the 3 races be dropped, would another pick up the mantle and hold a sprint race instead? Sprint races may still concern some hardcore purist fans, but it is a gentle step that shouldn't undermine F1's DNA. The quickest drivers and teams won't face any penalty for succeeding, which was what many feared with reverse grids. One valid concern would be what the presence of another race in the weekend format does for the main Grand Prix itself, and whether it would take any sheen off the Sunday event. But the annual Macau Grand Prix, a Formula 3 event, has run a sprint race format with its own qualification race on Saturdays, and it only served to add to the entertainment and variety of the weekend. The beauty of the sprint race experiment for F1 this year is that it could be rolled back quite easily if needed. If it turns out that sprint races were actually quite a bad idea, the fact they will only run at a handful of events makes it easy to remove. And the opposite is also true. If they prove to be a roaring success, then it can be expanded very easily. With the teams provisionally on board for a trial of sprint races in F1 this year, the biggest hurdle has already been overcome. F1's new working group will iron out the details in the coming weeks, but once clarity arrives, it should give another reason to get excited for the 2021 season and has to be considered an impressive early success in Stefano Domenicali's leadership of Formula 1. What do you think of the idea of sprint races in F1? Should the sport keep its traditional Saturday qualifying, or will things be better with action spread out over 3 days? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more videos.